Assalamu alaikum all. Welcome back to episode 3 of the Muslim Voice podcast. Today we welcome Dr. Amina Shareef, lecturer in education at Goldsmiths University, alumni of Cambridge, and prominent Islamic and anti-Muslim racism researcher. Welcome to the Muslim Voice. Doctor, how are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me. It's
No
really,
worries.
great to be on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And if you could just start off, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing at the moment.
Okay. So, as you mentioned in the interview or in the introduction, I am a researcher of anti-Muslim racism.
Yeah.
And that means that I really pay attention to a lot of what's happening politically that might not typically be understood as anti-Muslim racism. And I try to look for ways in which a particular political project could be tracked back to Islamophobia. And I am an educationalist, which means I study educational processes, I study schools and curriculum and pedagogy and so on and so forth, or at least I'm supposed to as an educationalist. And so I'll do that through the question of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism, how that might look, how all these educational processes look like for young people, young Muslim people in particular.
Yeah. And if you could take us back to the beginning of your journey, obviously you pursued a degree in neurobiology and physiology, if I'm correct, at Purdue University. So what was it about your early work study internships, which you mentioned, that sort of pushed you away from that or made you feel disillusioned and what made you realize you had to push towards education?
Education, right. So maybe you can tell by my accent, I'm American. I grew up in the States, was educated there until I came to the UK for my PhD. And so my educational journey started in the hard sciences, right, which is kind of typical as a brown person from an Indo-Pac background. That's sort of what you're supposed to do without a lot of, deviance from that. And so in the US, you have to sort of do like an undergrad degree before you can apply for med school. And my undergrad degree that I had chosen was neurobiology and physiology. Now, I loved my degree. Don't get me wrong. It was so incredibly fascinating to learn about, these internal processes that happen in the body. And I mean, if you really study them with a perspective on drawing closer to God, you really are quite amazed by it. But unfortunately, that's not really the lens that higher education takes when it teaches us all of these disciplines, right? So we learn about biology from a strictly secular point of view, like all of these processes happen and they just happen, right? There's no grand sort of master behind all of them. So I didn't feel as if biology was a meaning-making space for me because it didn't speak the vocabularies that I was familiar with, right? So as a Muslim American, I was familiar with the Muslim tradition, right? And the Muslim ways of knowing, and the Muslim ways of being. And I didn't see it in my education as an undergrad. And it's almost like looking in a mirror and not seeing a reflection of yourself, right? So you kind of like, it doesn't resonate. There's this absence. There's something that's not quite clicking with you because you're kind of occupying the space with it without that space sort of responding to you. And meanwhile, as I was, going through my undergrad degree, I was doing these internships and they were just so incredibly dry. I don't know if you're an engineer, right?
Journalist.
You're a journalist. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're actually doing exciting things.
Yeah.
But some lab work can be very, very tedious. You're in the lab, you're pipetting like these micro millimeter solutions. And if you mess that up, then you have to repeat the process and then you can kill your sample. And it wasn't really the space for me. And around that time, I suddenly became interested in the intersection between education and racism because my own experiences with schooling in America were really marked by Islamophobia. And so just to give some context, I entered high school around the time 9/11 was happening. And literally the first day that I wore hijab to school was the day that 9/11 happened, right?
Wow.
And I tell this story only to demonstrate how the fallout of that political incident shaped the context in which I grew up, right? So it's only natural that somebody who wears hijab at that moment takes an interest in Islamophobia. And as a young person who's spending a lot of time at school, or the majority of her life at school, then there's a particular interest in how Islamophobia intersects with education. And so I had that experience that was speaking to me, and I had this opportunity to teach in an Islamic school after I graduated.
Yeah.
And it was just maternity cover. I didn't actually do well on that MCAT, which is this exam. Yeah.
I think you previously mentioned that that first teaching job was in a predominantly Somali, Arab, and Muslim school.
That's right.
Right. So what kind of challenges did you face in terms of that?
Sure. So just to take 2 steps back, I think I bombed that MCAT exam, by which I mean I did really bad. Okay, like really bad. And it goes to show that if there's not a real interest, then you're not going to excel in a particular area. And so I was sort of like floating around and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was studying for the LSAT at that point, which is another exam that you need to take before you go to law school. But while that was happening, there was this opportunity to teach at an Islamic school, and I took it because of that interest that I was talking about in education. And it was all Muslim, but predominantly Somali and predominantly Arab, and then some Indo-Pak. And it was challenging because I had nothing to do with education at that point. I didn't know anything about education, and it was as if I were entering my high school again, right? Only this time it was an Islamic one. But I started a master's degree in education, and it was an amazing opportunity actually to be able to study and to work at the same time in 2 areas that are interlinked. Because what I was doing is that I was bringing the theories that I was being exposed to it in my master's courses into the classroom. And then the classroom became this kind of laboratory for me to test out critical relevant pedagogies and experiment with curriculum and do really radical teaching, right? Teaching not just for exams, but teaching to create meaning, right? Teaching to give students tools to understand the world in which they live, and to make connections between stories that are happening and histories that are grounding the present, and so on and so forth. So it was a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah. And so looking back at that time of your life, are there any key moments or experiences that you remember that sort of shaped or started your passion for anti-racism work and decolonizing education?
So there was my experience with anti-Muslim racism as a young hijabi girl post 9/11, but then the university where I did my master's was really actually a radical university. Well, no, the education department was a radical department.
Okay.
Well, I keep using the word radical. It's probably not the right word to use. But what I mean by radical is that it wasn't like this old sociology approach to social sciences. It was cutting edge, and it was like, okay, well, let's talk about racism. We're going to talk about critical race concepts. We're going to talk about colonialism and the legacies of colonialism. And we're going to talk about these very thorny conversations. And we're going to talk about all of that in relation to education and how education perpetuates inequalities, how it perpetuates racism, how it creates a social order that is predicated on racial knowledge of people, right? And it maintains white interests, and it maintains privilege for some, and it creates conditions for unflourishing for others, right? And so this was the beginning then of like this sort of exposure into education and anti-racism. And since then, it's been how I see the world, how I see my work, how I see my place in terms of where I'm going to deliver the purpose for which I was created in this world.
Yeah. And navigating a, traditionally Western academic space, how have you maintained your Islamic identity, and have you found that difficult to do?
Right. Okay. This is such an important question. Yeah. And it's really important because we don't want to lose who we are as we go to university and as we live our lives, right? I think what has been fundamental has been the Quran, right? The Quran in an Indo-Pak sort of culture is something that you read really fast, right? Like your goal is to finish it cover to cover, and you're not supposed to, there's no emphasis on learning its meanings. You're supposed to memorize it without, doing any reflection. And that was sort of my engagement with the Quran as a young child as well. And then, alhamdulillah, I still had that culture of Quran, right, in my home. And I think that's what gave me a certain interest in it in my university days, in my undergrad days. But I also started reading like tafsir ibn Kathir, like really simple. You know how there's like that 10-volume series and you just grab a volume and read it. It wasn't a hardcore like tafsir studies or anything. It was just me trying to get at the meanings of the Quran. But I can't tell you how fundamental it was for me to be reading that tafsir at that time, that I was studying all of these theories on Marxism and post-structuralism and feminism and post-colonialism, because all of these isms, they come with a particular set of assumptions about how we know the world and what exists in the world, right? I'll give you an example. Particular in the social sciences, for example, there's a strong emphasis on understanding the world as being socially constructed, that all our concepts are socially produced by human beings. For example, gender is socially produced, and there's nothing inherent or essential to gender, right? You know that debate.
Yeah.
And then there's also this idea that human beings are also socially constructed through discourse, right? And if you don't have like a Islamic or Quranic background to some of these concepts, then you sort of buy into them, right? And for me, just reading the Quran made me attuned to this idea that, for example, there is something called the soul, and it's not socially constructed, right? There is something called the fitra that is innate and it's programmed within us. And through it, we have this kind of God intuition, and through it, we have a sense of what's right and wrong. And therefore, our sense of what is right and wrong is not only socially constructed. And so keeping that in mind, therefore, allowed me to read all of these social theories that I mentioned before through an Islamic lens. So I was able to say, hold on, I will accept, elements of post-structuralism, for example, so long as it conforms or is consistent with this Islamic worldview, this Tawhidic worldview. And so to respond to your question then, how do you maintain your Islamic identity as you go through university? It has to be the Quran, right? It can't just be going to the mosque and rituals. It's the Quran. The Quran it's social theory in a way. It's a way of seeing the world. And you have to do it. You have to engage with the Quran through reflection and thinking about its meanings.
Absolutely. And sort of going one step further, did you manage to, like you said, in such an Islamic value landscape, essentially, did you manage to incorporate Islamic values into your work? Mm-hmm. And did you think that was important to do?
100%. I came into university with this conviction that I was a Muslim, and I wasn't going to do anything unless it was consistent with my Muslimness. And so I remember the first year I was at Cambridge for my PhD. And this first year you have to submit, at the end of this first year, you have to submit this registration report, which is like your first chapter, your second chapter, and your third chapter of your thesis, ultimately. But it never ends up that way. But in it, you have to describe your literature that you're engaging with, and you have to talk about your methodology, right? Like, how are you going to go about doing the research that you want to do? And in the methodology section, you have to talk about, okay, what are your philosophical assumptions that you're taking in this project? In other words, how are you approaching the idea of what exists, right? And how are you approaching the idea of how we know what exists in the first place, right? And I remember when I was writing this methodology chapter, I was going through handbook after handbook. I was reading about narrative methodology, and I didn't like it, put it to the side. I was reading about phenomenology, and I didn't like it, and I put it to the side. I was reading about, different constructivism, and then there was something in it that didn't resonate with my Islamic sort of framework, and I put it to the side. And I went through these different methodological approaches to social science research, completely dissatisfied, with what they were allowing me to do in my work and how to think about social reality, because they're all written from a very secular perspective and where God is not centered at all. And ways of knowing that are not rooted in a kind of spiritual tradition are not even seen as ways of knowing. So, for example, in the Islamic tradition, we believe like the heart is a site of intellection, right? It's that the heart, it's not just the mind that is involved in producing knowledge, but the heart is as well. And spiritual practice, therefore, is part of that process. Prayer, fasting, qiyam, tadabbur, recitation of the Quran, those practices feed into how you are perceiving, interpreting, producing knowledge. But there's no space for that. That's not part of the methodology of social science in the canons as we understand it. So I remember not making my deadline for that methodology chapter, and I was okay with that. I did not want to produce something that wasn't consistent with an Islamic worldview, a Tawhidic worldview, right?
Yeah.
And so to respond to your question then, was I able to bring it in? I was, because I insisted, right? But I think it would be difficult for people to bring it in to their work if they don't know what they're bringing in the first place, which goes back to the importance of having that really deep connection with the Quran, understanding what is it doing? What is it saying to me? Because at the end of the day, we don't want to be these kind of liberal subjects that simply do more of what everyone else is doing, right? We want to bring that special thing to the table, which comes from the Quran and Sunnah.
Absolutely. Very important advice, actually. And I want to kind of talk about a concept that you mentioned in some of your work before, besieged life.
Sure.
And if you could explain what it is and how it applies to young British Muslims and young British Muslim women as well.
Right. Okay. So besieged life is this theory that I began to develop in my PhD. And it connects to this effort to bring in the Islamic perspective into social science theorizing, right? So my research was really interested in how young Muslim girls between the ages of 12 and 18 were experiencing and responding to Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism. And so I had to, in my work, lay out how I was understanding anti-Muslim racism, okay? So there's several ways we can understand anti-Muslim racism. One is that it's a prejudice, it's a bias. It's something that bad apples do in society, but they're just bad apples and they're marginalized, and it's not how society overall, generally speaking, thinks about Islam and Muslims. That's one perspective. I don't subscribe to that perspective at all. Okay. Because there's another perspective which holds that Islamophobia is institutionalized. It's a form of racism, right? And therefore it's very much a way of organizing society, right, along racial categories, right? So I really located myself in this way of thinking about Islamophobia as a form of racism. But I went beyond that to say, you know what? I'm not going to think with liberal ideas of what counts as racism, because liberalism comes with the assumption that we have a level playing field in society, that everybody's equal, and everybody has equal opportunity and chances. But this is actually a liberal conceit, right? The scholars of race and racism have shown that actually there's a racial liberalism here at play, which means that Black and brown people were never considered eligible for liberal rights. So there's no equal playing field here. Imagine a track where you've got runners at the end of they start in the inside of the track and they start further out. Yeah. I mean, that's how it is for white populations versus brown and Black populations. There's this kind of privilege that's experienced by some and not by others. So I don't subscribe to these liberal notions of racism. And what that means is that I see racism through concepts that recognize that racism is a kind of management of populations, but through death itself, right? I know this is a really heavy conversation to be having here on this lighthearted podcast. But what I mean to say is that, for example, if you're Muslim, we know that you are less likely to have the same educational, employment, health, and healthcare opportunities, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, we could simply say, oh, look, anti-Muslim racism, it means that you're being excluded from social opportunity. But what happens really when you are excluded from health and healthcare? When you're excluded from employment and education and decent housing? It's a kind of slow death of a population, right? So the way I like to understand anti-Muslim racism is that it is a form of racism, but that has the effect of producing the slow death of a Muslim population, right? Now let's go back to my research here.
Yeah.
So these young girls, I'm locating them, therefore, in this understanding of anti-Muslim racism that's producing the slow death of a population. And they find themselves, being seen as oppressed, as seen as dangerous, as seen as so on and so forth. And they try to avoid that. And what I'm trying to say is by avoiding being racialized in that way, they are trying to avoid early death, right? Okay. But how do they avoid being seen as oppressed and as dangerous and so on and so forth? They do it by distancing themselves from visible signs of Muslimness. In other words, they will take off their hijab, or they will modify their hijab to make it seem less Muslim, right? Because they don't want to be seen as that kind of Muslim who's oppressed and dangerous. But so what I'm arguing is that now these young girls are experiencing this kind of devitalization of their Islamic identity, which I'm interpreting as a kind of a spiritual death. So besieged life, therefore, is this concept that locates Muslims between two forms of death. That slow death, which is a result of a lack of access to housing, employment, education, and so forth, and then this kind of spiritual death, which they have to undergo in order to avoid physical death. Okay. So that's the besieged life. It's sieged by death itself. That was a long description.
Very interesting though. So what's the way out? If there is a way out, what's the way out for young Muslim women?
That is an excellent question. And so I talk about that in my work as well, as I try to develop this notion of besieged life. And my description of besieged life at the moment is that it's a death-bound subject. In other words, it escapes death through death itself. I'll tell you how. If you want to avoid that physical death, lack of access to education, employment, housing, and so on and so forth, you have to unbecome a Muslim. So you escape physical death through spiritual death. But if you want to live that spiritual life and escape spiritual death, then you're confronted with this kind of slow death, right? So besieged life, it faces death on two fronts, and it can only escape death through death of a different part of themselves, either physical or spiritual. So there's this kind of bind now where you can't really escape that. You're either exposed to physical death or spiritual death.
Okay.
Not very optimistic, I know.
No, not really. So, and physical death and spiritual death, in what ways would they, if you could give some examples of that in young Muslim women today, how would that come about?
Okay. Examples of spiritual death for me would be creating distance between practicing Islam, and your visible Muslim expression, right? What does that mean? So some young girls in my study, what they would do is that, the obvious example would be that they would take off their hijabs, okay? So they're saying essentially, by taking off their hijabs, I don't want to be physically, visibly, publicly be seen as Muslim, known as Muslim, right? Why? Because of everything that is being attributed to the hijab and everything that is being said about Muslim women and girls. So they take off the hijabs, and for me, that removing of the hijab is their spiritual identity being devitalized. In other words, it's being watered down, it's being enervated, it doesn't have the full force, right? And that's a kind of spiritual death, isn't it? Because death doesn't have to be final or complete. I don't mean to suggest that simply taking off the hijab means you're not a Muslim anymore, but I'm saying there's forms of death in life, isn't there? Like you can be in a state of a kind of living death as well, where you're not fully alive, but you're not fully dead either. You're not fully able to practice your Muslimness, but you're not dead either, right? So it's a kind of spiritual devitalization, which I'm seeing as spiritual death. And then physical death would be, again, it doesn't have to be immediate. It can be protracted or slow. So for example, if you don't have equal opportunity to education, and therefore that means you won't have the same access to housing, and therefore you won't have the same access to employment, right? and then you won't have the same access to health. And all of those metrics here, all of these factors contribute to a flourishing life. So essentially, you're not able to flourish as a human being. If you're not able to flourish, then you're sort of in this state where you're only surviving, and you're exposed to the problems that come with the lack of health and healthcare, with the lack of employment, and so on and so forth, which is a kind of slow death, isn't it?
And do you see a future where the factors in the first place that create this besieged life for Muslims, do you see a future where in the West those factors could be no more, or is that almost too much to ask for with the current landscape of the way things are?
We are in a situation of besieged life right now. And what drives besieged life is securitization of Islam, right? The moment you attribute violence to Islam, the believers of Islam, Muslims, therefore become, prone to violence or inclined to violence, or therefore, very simply, violent themselves, right? And what that means then is that Muslims are a threat. And what do you do with the threat? You eliminate a threat, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that so long as securitization of Islam exists, you're going to have a politics that has to sort of incapacitate the threat and eliminate the threat and expose that threat to conditions that besiege it. Otherwise, that threat flourishes. And that threat threatens, therefore, the population that has been deemed as threatened by the threat, right? So I think what needs to happen, therefore, is the dismantling of these discourses, the discourses of terrorism. And I wrote an opinion piece for Al Jazeera on this topic, in which I describe that these discourses of terrorism, they actually give permission to kill Muslim people and Muslim populations. And I had that discussion in the context of Gaza and what's happening, and how that discourse is a permission to authorize death and violence against Muslim populations. So we need to dismantle those discourses, and therefore we need to dismantle those policies, right, like prevent and counter extremism that perpetuate this idea that Muslims are a threat and need to be, managed and incapacitated and so on and so forth.
Is one of the ways to do that some of the work you've done with the YMWOP here in Sheffield?
Yeah.
And if it is, could you talk to us a little bit about what that was, why you decided it was needed?
Sure.
And sort of what effect did it have on those who participated?
Okay. So the Young Muslim Women's Leadership Program, or the YMWLP, which is a mouthful.
Yep,
and I was concentrating when I said that. So this program, it was a leadership program that I set up for young Muslim girls between the ages of 12 and 18. And the idea was that we need a different kind of educational space, right? So here I am in education, here I am studying anti-Muslim racism, and for me, they are very much intertwined. And in this particular moment, it's very hard to separate the two and say, look, Muslim girls, go to school and try to come out whole. It's very hard to expect that of them. So what I thought was necessary was this alternative educational space that didn't come with the assumption that these girls are oppressed, that didn't come with the assumption that these girls' parents or fathers or brothers or uncles are radicalizing forces for them or are vulnerable to radicalization. It didn't come with any of those assumptions. It came with the assumption that recognized what Islam was, right? It was a Muslim faith-based organization. And the idea, therefore, was let's raise critical consciousness of these young girls about the context within which they're living. Because when we raise our critical consciousness and give vocabulary and name what's happening around us, we're able to demystify what's happening. And we're able to say, you know what, I understand what's happening, and I'm not going to be bowled over by it. I'm not going to be confused, surprised by it. I'm not going to, therefore, feel fear or anxiety about it. And I'm, most importantly, not going to see myself as a problem, but I'm going to see that I've been problematized, right? Okay. And that was fundamental to the process of this program. It was to tell Muslim girls, yes, there's an Islamophobia out there, but you're not the problem. You've been made the problem. So therefore, let's move away from this victim kind of mindset, and we're going to become actors and change makers, okay? We're going to see each one of you, and we're going to believe that each one of you has the capacity to make change and to participate fully in society. And so that was the second sort of prong of this program. It was to build capacity for these young girls to engage the public space, right? Because part of not being scared of Islamophobia is to say, look, I have a legitimate right to occupy the public space, and I belong here, and I can contribute in a meaningful way, right? I think we see the problems of society, and we know that Islam has a lot to contribute to those problems. And we are ambassadors of Islam. We carry that Islam, and if we bring it to society, there will be a lot of benefit. So essentially, that was what the leadership program was. So it was raising critical consciousness, building capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. Were there any sort of specific success stories that you remember? Where you saw the first-hand impact of the work, in a specific person?
You know what? I'm a qualitative researcher and thinker. What that means is I don't do surveys, and I don't ask young people to fill out on a scale of 1 to 5. How effective did you see was this intervention, and so on and so forth. I don't do that. Maybe to my detriment. Maybe I should, as a way of saying, look, this intervention had impact. But what I can say is that I saw a marked difference in the girls at the time they started from the time they left the program. And we had this program running for about 2 years. And COVID made us sort of, go online. And then online, it wasn't sort of a viable platform for this program, because a lot of our work was building relationships and building community and building, security between each other to open up and have these conversations. So we closed it then, but I think, inshallah, we're going to start it up again.
Sounds good.
So there was no way to measure. I don't think I have any, concrete metric of whether it worked or not. But I can say that it was very meaningful to the girls. And a lot of the girls keep in touch with me. And they always say, you know what, we had this fantastic time, and you helped me to gain confidence in myself. And I think that kind of feedback tells us a lot about the importance of that work, and inshallah, the necessity of continuing that work in the future.
Absolutely. If we can talk a little bit about your time in Switzerland.
Yeah.
Lausanne, if I'm right there.
Yeah.
You co-founded the Stand project.
That's right.
If I'm right, to counter the far-right discourse of the UDC. So if you could give us a little bit of context in terms of that situation and the challenges you faced in shifting public narratives on anti-Muslim racism in that country.
Sure. So my first foray into anti-Islamophobia activism was actually in Switzerland. And I ended up in Switzerland because at that time, my husband was doing some postdocs, and I had just finished my master's. I hadn't yet started my PhD, and, I just followed him along. And so we were there about 4 years, and it was an amazing experience. And it was really eye-opening to how some of old Europe picks up Islamophobia. And because we were in Lausanne, which is in the Francophone region of Switzerland, so Switzerland has 3 borders, and each border speaks a different language based on its proximity to that border, right? So Lausanne was near the French border, therefore it spoke French. And so it imported a lot of French Islamophobia in the region. But the UDC in general was a very far-right kind of political party, and it drew on some of the same themes that a lot of far-right parties in Europe draw on, such as this idea that Muslims are taking over Europe, that there's this great replacement that is underway, that Islam is turning Europe into this colonized outpost, so on and so forth. And then the visible symbols of Islam, very public symbols of Islam are therefore to be banned, right? Because it's a sign of this demographic kind of takeover. So the niqab was banned eventually in Switzerland, I think, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, we can look that up. But the minaret, the right minarets were definitely banned in Switzerland. There were referendum to ban the niqab. Muslim women who tried to pursue certain career paths in Switzerland find closed doors just because the hijab was not seen as something that was permissible in that space, right? So many young women that I befriended and knew who were doing certain careers just couldn't do those careers or had to take their hijabs off to do so. For example, education, for example, in healthcare, and so on and so forth. But the Stand Project then, therefore, was this response to the far-right party, and it was simply a stand. That's exactly what it was. And in the middle of Lausanne, on Saturdays and Wednesdays, it was really fascinating what would happen. You would have all of these political parties that would set up their stands, and they would distribute flyers, and they would have their brochures, and they would talk with people. And this was something that I was looking to see here in the UK, not realizing that there are fewer political parties here. Of course, you have more political parties here than you do in the US, which is like Republican, Democrat, and Green Party. That's barely known, right? But it was really, really, really interesting in Lausanne, where on those 2 days, all day long, or at least in the morning until like 2:00, you had all of these different political groups just trying to get their voice heard and trying to educate the public about who they were. And it was in the thick of that political milieu that we sort of set up the Stand Project, and we were trying to dispel some ideas about Islam and Muslims. And a lot of people were coming toward the stand, and they were talking about, they're asking us questions about all sorts of things. And it was fabulous. It was a great beginning to doing this work. And of course, colleagues there have gone on to institutionalize some of what we began there. And then when we came to the UK, we became involved in the more institutionalized forms of grassroots advocacy against Islamophobia. And there's many institutions here in this country that allow you to do that.
So, of course, talking about Switzerland, they've also worked in the USA, which themselves obviously don't have a great history in terms of Islamophobia, and the UK, like you mentioned there. What's one thing you think young Muslims should keep in mind when addressing the issues that you just mentioned there that came about in Switzerland, and also obviously are very prevalent in the USA and the UK? So what's one thing you think Muslims should keep in mind when addressing these issues?
Mm-hmm. So even though I take the view that Islamophobia is institutional, it's not just the case of few bad apples in society. It's embedded in our education system. It's embedded in how work is distributed. It's embedded in the distribution of good and dignified housing. It's embedded in security policy, in migration policy, in education policy, right? That's what I mean by Islamophobia being institutionalized, right? But in spite of it being institutionalized, you also have people who have Islamophobic ideas about Islam and Muslims, right? So we can't sort of forget this aspect as we acknowledge that Islamophobia is institutionalized. So in other words, there has to be a two-pronged approach, therefore, to tackling Islamophobia. One approach is tackling the institutionalized Islamophobia, and that is a project of people who have the skills in that particular area, right? You're going to be a journalist. You're a journalist,
yes.
And you will be working towards dispelling institutionalized Islamophobia, dismantling it. Others who have expertise in policy, right? In education as educators, right? Or in management, they can do that work of dismantling institutional Islamophobia. And a lot of us cannot, and that's fine. And so we have to accept that there are two spaces where Islamophobia proliferates, right? And if you can have an impact in dismantling Islamophobia in the everyday, right, through people's perceptions, then that's really important as well. And so I think there is a way for everybody to get involved here. And I don't think we need to say, I don't have the requisite knowledge to tackle institutionalized Islamophobia, therefore I wash my hands, I can't do anything. But actually, no, you can get involved with dispelling everyday assumptions about Islam and Muslims.
How would you advise people to go about that? Because obviously, from their sort of view, that might seem like way too big for one person to tackle on their own. So how would you advise people to start?
Mm-hmm. That's such a good question. How? You know what? I think we're really lucky in the UK to have grassroots organizations that have been installed to do this work of fighting Islamophobia. And this is not the case in other parts of Europe. For example, in France, they had the CCIF, which was dismantled. Then it moved to Belgium. It's now existing as the CCIE, but it's just one organ, right? In Switzerland, there are a few people who are doing this work, but I don't think it's as institutionalized as CCIE, for example. In the UK, you have a slew, actually, of institutions who are doing this work. The MCB, for example, MEND. Then you also have CPF, which is Community Policy Forum. MEND stands for Muslim Engagement and Development. MCB is the Muslim Council of Britain. You also have Educate Against Islamophobia. You have Muslim-friendly employers, right? You also now have the Muslim Vote. So you have all of these organizations that are trying to get Muslims involved in this fight against Islamophobia. So let's just take MEND, for example. MEND is a national organization, grassroots, entirely community funded. It has working groups up and down the country, right? From London all the way to Scotland. So up and down the UK. And you can get involved in a working group. You just go onto the website and you put in your details, and it will someone will put you in touch with the working group in your area. And that working group, therefore, meets regularly. They have this plan, this community engagement model, where they will, engage stakeholders, the wider community. They'll develop relationships with MPs and police and so on and so forth to tackle Islamophobia in that particular locality. So that's just one example of how we can do that work, right? We don't have to think that we need to invent the wheel all by ourselves, all over again. Just get involved with some of these organizations, and you'll see that there is already the structure in place that you just have to follow, really, to do this work. So going back to MEND has has poured so much resource into producing a strategy, a community engagement strategy, and a strategy for tackling Islamophobia. And so I think it's really important to just get involved in what already exists as opposed to trying to do it on your own.
Absolutely. So jumping on from that note, if a young British Muslim woman was to come to you today and say that they feel like they have to choose between their faith and career or academic success, what would you say to them?
Well, God says in the Quran, Allah says in the Quran that don't die except as a Muslim. And I've always been so taken aback by that verse. Every time I read it, it hits me hard every time because it's so definitive, don't die. If you stop there, that's already really interesting as a read. Yeah. But then don't die except as a Muslim, which means the purpose of this life, therefore, is to die in a particular way. Because if a purpose of a life is how you should be living that life, then the way you live that life determines how you die as well, right? Yeah. So if God says don't die except as a Muslim, then we need to make sure that the way we live our life allows us to die in that way. And so the reassuring thing about your question is that we won't be in a situation, inshallah, where we have to choose between the two. Because the form of spiritual death and actual death is not complete, in the sense that you might find yourself forced to not publicly reveal your religion at times. But if you can practice it in your heart and practice it in your home, then, that is really important to maintain, right? Continue to do. So don't think that those are binaries, that you have to choose between one or the other. Keep looking for a space that allows you to be completely consistent with your spiritual convictions, right? And if that's not possible, then know that you were created for that particular moment and instance, right? And you have to find your destiny in that situation that Allah has given you. And so just do what you can in that circumstance.
And absolutely. To finish off from our side, where do you see the future of Muslim advocacy, academia, and education going? And in the West, of course. And what legacy do you hope to leave behind for that exact thing? So Muslim advocacy for future generations here in the West.
So there's two questions there that I'd like to separate. The first is, where are we heading?
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm not going to paint a doom and gloom picture, because I actually believe that the Muslim critical consciousness is raising, right? We are seeing more and more increased Muslim literacy in politics, like understanding what's going on in the world and giving meaning to what's happening and understanding that it's time to get out and do something now. We saw this most clearly with the marches, the pro-Palestine marches. You had like aunties in church of our, out there begging bogonas, pots and pans and things like that. And I never saw that before. My mom was marching. My dad was marching. I never saw them march before, right? And there was this kind of awakening. And I think we, as a believer, we always look for the good in every situation. So even in Gaza, even with this genocide in Gaza, we look for what good it has done as well. And one good is that it has awoken Muslim people to the danger of what happens if you don't challenge Islamophobia, right? Gaza is a textbook example of what awaits. What is the end game of Islamophobia? It's death itself. It's genocide. It's the elimination of a population. And we have been awakened to that. And we saw it coming for those who are already in the advocacy sector. And many of us didn't see it coming, but now we see that it's a real future possibility. And I think it's going to compel and urge people to be more serious about standing up for justice, standing up for rights, standing up for the people who are oppressed, and making sure that Gaza doesn't repeat itself as it can very possibly do, right? We know Muslim people are being killed in India, for example, lynched, and you have these communal forms of violence. And we know the Uyghur Muslims are subjected to slow death, right? They're put in these re-education centers, and they are untaught how to be Muslim and sinicized, right? They're forced to assimilate to Chinese culture, dominant Chinese culture. And you had the Rohingya, right? Their mass death was their fate as well. We know that this is the trajectory that we're on if we don't do anything, or we're starting to realize that. So I'm positive in that regard. I think Muslims are waking up to that, and they understand the urgency of acting, and they will act now in different ways. And let this be a call, therefore, to urge people to look for ways to interact in meaningful ways, to engage this question of Islamophobia in meaningful ways, institutionally, or through these grassroots organizations. Now, the second question.
Bit of a loaded one, but
yeah, go ahead. Could you repeat it again?
So what would you like to see as your legacy in the world of academia, in the world of advocacy? What do you want to be left behind from your side?
Mm-hmm. Right. I think for a long time I tried to figure out how I was going to fulfill my purpose on this planet, right? Because Allah has given all of us a purpose. And that purpose is expressed and manifested in different ways for all of us. But that purpose stays, the same. But it's going to look different, right? And so what we need to do is think about our strengths, what Allah has given us in terms of resources, intellectual resources, economic resources, mental resources, right? Not everybody has a mental capacity to do the work that you're entering into, right? Journalism is a really cutthroat kind of industry, and you are going to you will face a lot of heat for what you're going to say if you're going to say something that stands up against injustice, if you're going to speak truth to power, right? Not everybody has the mental resource to handle that kind of engagement. So it's important, therefore, for us to think about the kind of resources we have and to say, yes, I can contribute in this way. And I don't have these resources, so I'm not going to contribute in this way, and therefore it's fine, right? You tap into your resources, marshal those resources, and be the best you can be with what you've been given. That is a legacy that we need to be leaving behind, right? Or the legacy that we leave behind is a function of what we have been given by Allah. So my advice then to young people is, don't think about what you don't have in terms of skills, capacity, competencies. Think about what you do have. Think about building those up. And then think about how you can fulfill your purpose through them. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be asked about what you couldn't do because you didn't have the resources to do, right? You won't be asked why didn't you give $1 million every year if you didn't have $1 million to give in the first place. So similarly, you won't be asked why you didn't act if you weren't given the resources to do so. So the real focus then should be on what we have, what our skill set is, and how we can channel those in the service of our purpose for which we were created.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you for coming on. I think very enlightening conversation there. And I think that should hopefully be very beneficial to a lot of young people.
Inshallah. Thank you for
so
having
much.
me.
No, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
So that's episode 3 of the Muslim Voice podcast, done and dusted. Thank you for listening. Out on all platforms, Spotify and YouTube. Follow the Instagram at the Muslim Voice podcast for more updates there. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.